It's time for a new series of Devo tips on the weird laws in the Bible. Scripture does contain some difficult laws to interpret. It's not hard to imagine that one day someone will try to ban the Bible because of them. So let's talk about the weird laws. You don't need to be embarrassed about them. They're not as weird as you might think. Take the laws concerning slavery, for example. The Israelites had come to Egypt as refugees during a famine. They were an ethnic minority in a large imperial state. When a new pharaoh changed Egypt's immigration policy, the Israelites were forced into slavery. They knew what it's like to be discriminated against. They had been slaves not by choice, but because they were Hebrews. The 10 plagues poured out on Egypt demonstrates how God feels about racial slavery. But notice, immediately after the 10 Commandments, the very first law God gave to Israel concerned the treatment of slaves. In it, God was essentially saying, if you have slaves, do not treat them like you were treated in Egypt. You must protect and dignify them. So why doesn't God just prohibit slavery? Well, he does, actually. God bans the type of slavery that kidnaps human beings and sells them for the purpose of human trafficking. Notice Exodus 21:16. God says this, kidnappers must be put to death, whether they are caught in possession of their victims or have already sold them as slaves. According to Scripture, the kidnapping of any person for the purpose of enslaving them is a capital crime. The Bible absolutely condemns human trafficking. So when the Old Testament uses the word slavery, it's talking about debt slavery. What's that? Debt slavery was the only option for people who could not pay their debts or who found themselves in abject poverty. When the poor could not provide for their families, there was no welfare system available. The law offered provisions to help them work off their debt. Debt slavery was voluntary. People could willingly offer their labor in exchange for outstanding debts. In return, masters would provide for all their needs. Such servitude, however, was limited to a 6-year contract. After that, slaves were free to move on or keep working. Their debts were forgiven. In the New Testament, Roman slavery was vastly different. Most slaves were prisoners of war, which means they were tradesmen, doctors, lawyers, and even politicians. But they lived under a formidable authoritarian state. Were Jesus or Paul or any of the early Christians to call for their immediate emancipation would have led to their mass execution. But notice that Paul encourages slaves who were able to gain their freedom to avail yourself of the opportunity, he says. He also lists human traffickers among those who are ungodly and profane, and puts them in the same category as murderers, the sexually immoral, and the perjurers in 1 Timothy 1:8-10. Apparently, the Bible's weird laws about slavery aren't so weird after all. So tune in next week for more weird laws in the Bible.